My grandmother prayed every single morning for 60 years, never missed a day, and died at 91 with a sharper mind than most 50-year-olds. Her doctor called it luck, and if science is now calling it something else entirely. And what science is calling it should make you stop whatever you are doing right now. Because if this research means what it appears to mean, then the most powerful brain protection tool in human history was sitting in a wooden chair in your grandmother's living room every morning at 6 o'clock. And most of us walked right past it. Let me tell you something that will make you uncomfortable. The medical establishment has spent billions of dollars searching for a cure to dementia. Billions. And the answer may have been hiding inside the daily habits of Christian grandmothers for over a century. Not in a laboratory, not in a clinical trial, in a morning routine that looked, to the modern eye, like nothing more than an old woman being religious. I have spent over 2 decades studying the intersection of biblical wisdom and human flourishing, not from a pulpit, but from the patterns that emerge when you read scripture and then hold those patterns up against what science keeps discovering. And I want to be clear about something before we go any further. What I am about to share is not a substitute for professional consultation. It is a scriptural and scientific pattern that I believe every thinking Christian needs to understand. What you do with it is between you and your physician. But here is what I can tell you. The pattern is real. The research is documented, and most pastors will not say this from a stage. We are going to cover a lot of ground today. The dementia epidemic that nobody warned you about, the anomaly that scientists could not explain, the neuroscience of what your grandmother was actually doing in that chair, the simple daily habit that ties everything together, and then what we lost and how to get it back. Stay with me, because the most important moment in this entire teaching is coming at about the 3/4 mark, and everything before it is building towards something that is going to reframe how you see your own daily life. 1 in 3. That is the number. 1 in every 3 people who live past 85 will develop dementia. Not may develop it, will. That is not a projection. That is the current documented trajectory for the Western world, and the numbers are accelerating. Right now, approximately 55 million people worldwide are living with dementia. By 2050, that number is projected to reach 139 million, nearly 3 times where we are today. Modern medicine has no cure. There is management, there is delay, there is mitigation, but there is no reversal. Once the damage accumulates past a certain threshold, the best science available can only slow the decline. It cannot stop it, it cannot undo it. So the most honest medical voices in this conversation are not asking how we cure dementia. They are asking why some people never get it. And that question, that specific question, led researchers into territory they were not prepared for. Because here is what the statistics hide. There are pockets of people, particular kinds of communities, where dementia rates are dramatically lower than the surrounding population. Not slightly lower, measurably, significantly, consistently lower. And for a long time, researchers could not explain why. They ruled out genetics, they looked at diet, education levels, physical activity, and they kept running into one variable that made them deeply uncomfortable: faith, specifically structured daily religious practice. Hold that question, because the answer is more specific and more actionable than you think. The research did not begin in a boardroom or a pharmaceutical company. It began with nuns. In 1986, a researcher named David Snowden at the University of Kentucky began tracking 678 Catholic nuns from the School Sisters of Notre Dame in what became known as the Nun Study. He followed them for decades. He collected cognitive tests, personal histories, and eventually, with the sisters' consent, autopsies of their brains after death. What he found shook the scientific community. Some of these women, when their brains were examined after death, showed the full physical markers of advanced Alzheimer's disease. The plaques were there, the tangles were there. By every biological measure, these women should have been severely cognitively impaired, but they had not been. They had been sharp, engaged, Mentally present, weeks before they died, some of them were teaching classes. The brain had the disease. The person did not seem to have it. And the question became, what were these women doing that was protecting them? Purpose was one variable. Structured routine was another. But the most persistent thread that kept surfacing was this. Every single one of these women had a daily practice, fixed, intentional, repetitive, and centered on something outside themselves. Morning prayer, scripture reading, communal liturgy, quiet contemplation, the rosary, hymn recitation, not occasionally, every day. For decades, researchers initially dismissed the faith variable as coincidental. They were looking for a mechanism. You can know something and not understand it. And the scientific community knew these women were different. They did not yet understand why. So they started looking closer, not at the faith itself, but at what the faith was making these women do every single day. Let me tell you what your grandmother was actually doing in that chair. And I want to be precise here because this is where most of the popular conversation gets it wrong. She was not receiving a supernatural brain shield. I am not saying that is impossible, but that is not the mechanism this research is describing. What she was doing was engaging a specific neurological state every single morning for 60 years, without a prescription, without a device, without any awareness that she was doing something neuroscientists would spend millions of dollars trying to understand and replicate. Here is what I mean by that. Your brain has what researchers call a default mode network, the DMN. It is the network that activates when your mind is wandering, unfocused, ruminating on past regrets, or anxious about future threats. When you are scrolling your phone, the DMN is largely active. When you are lying awake at 3 in the morning, running through your problems, the DMN is running the show. And chronic overactivation of the default mode network is now understood to be one of the primary drivers of the neuroinflammation that precedes cognitive decline. Your grandmother's morning practice suppressed that network. Every single day, focused, repetitive, intentional mental activity quiets the DMN. It shifts the brain into a state of directed attention that simultaneously lowers cortisol, reduces inflammatory signaling, and activates the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for judgment, planning, and memory consolidation. She was not just praying, it was resetting her brain's stress architecture daily. For 60 years, Proverbs 8:34 says, "Blessed is the one who listens to me, watching daily at my gates, waiting beside my doors." And if Scripture does not whisper on this one, there is a reason the wisdom literature of the Bible does not tell you to seek wisdom occasionally, or when you feel like it, or when life slows down. It says daily, watching daily. The pattern is embedded in the text itself. But here is where it gets really interesting, and where modern neuroscience had to swallow its pride. Researchers at the University of Pennsylvania studied people engaged in prayer and deep meditative practice. What they found was not subtle. They found measurable structural changes in the brains of long-term practitioners. The prefrontal cortex, that region I just described, was physically thicker in people who had maintained a daily focused practice for years. Thicker, more developed, more capable, reduced cortisol levels, reduced inflammatory markers, increased gray matter density in the regions of the brain that control memory and attention. The brain was not just functioning differently in the moment of practice, it was structurally different over time, growing in response to the habit. This is what neuroscientists call neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to physically change in response to repeated patterns of use. You have heard this principle applied to learning languages or playing instruments. This research showed it applies with equal force to prayer and contemplative practice. The brain your grandmother had at 91 was not the brain she was born with. It was the brain she built every morning. In that chair, here's what I want you to type in the comments right now before we go any further. Just type the number 91 because I want to know how many of you are watching this and thinking about a specific person, a grandmother, a grandfather, an aunt, someone from that generation whose mind stayed sharp in a way that felt almost unnatural. Just the number 91. I will know exactly what you mean. Now, let me show you the mechanism that ties all of this together, because without this piece, the picture is incomplete. Cortisol, the primary stress hormone in the human body. Your body releases it when it perceives threat. In acute, short term situations, cortisol is useful. It mobilizes energy, it sharpens focus, it prepares you for a physical challenge. But chronic cortisol elevation, the kind produced by ongoing psychological stress that never fully resolves, is neurologically devastating. And the specific region it attacks most aggressively is the hippocampus, the brain's primary memory center, the structure that consolidates new information and retrieves old information. Chronic cortisol literally shrinks the hippocampus measurably, structurally. Over years, and modern life is a cortisol delivery machine. The news cycle is designed to keep you in a state of low-grade threat response. Social media is architecturally built to trigger comparison, inadequacy, and outrage. All cortisol activating states: financial anxiety, social fragmentation, the dissolution of community structures, the collapse of multi-generational households. All of it feeds the same hormonal pattern: chronic elevation, chronic hippocampal stress, chronic neurodegeneration. Of your grandmother's generation was not living without stress. Do not romanticize it. They faced wars, poverty, loss, illness, but they had something built into the architecture of their daily lives that functioned as a cortisol off switch: the morning ritual, the quiet, the repetition, the community, the fixed moment in the day when the noise stopped and something else took over. 1 Thessalonians 5:17 says, "Pray without ceasing." The theological interpretations of that verse are many, but the neurological interpretation is becoming very clear. A mind that returns to a state of focused stillness repeatedly throughout the day is a mind that never allows cortisol to accumulate to toxic levels. The instruction to pray without ceasing was not just a spiritual directive, it was a description of an operating system. And here is the question that should stay with you. What if the most powerful dementia prevention tool available to you right now is not a pill, not a supplement, not a diet, but something you were quietly taught to treat as optional? We have built to this moment across this entire teaching. And I want to give you what I promised. Here is the simple daily habit, not as a general idea, as a specific, replicable, scientifically grounded practice you can begin tomorrow morning. Every studied group that showed anomalous cognitive resilience, the nuns, of the long-term practitioners in the research studies, the deeply religious elderly populations that consistently outlier in dementia studies, every single one of them shared the same 5 structural elements in their daily practice. Not the same religion, not the same prayers, not the same tradition. The same 5 structural elements. The first is fixed time. Same moment every day. Your brain is a pattern recognition system. It runs on circadian rhythms. When you anchor a practice to a fixed daily time, particularly morning before the noise of the day begins, you create what researchers call circadian entrainment. The brain begins to anticipate the state. It prepares. Over weeks and months, the transition into the low-stress, high-focus state becomes faster, deeper, and more automatic. Your grandmother did not have to fight to get into that state. She had been practicing for 40 years. Her brain was trained. The second is repetitive, verbal, or silent recitation. Repetition activates the language networks and the memory consolidation systems simultaneously. The rosary, the psalms, hymns, specific prayers said in the same order every day. These are not theologically less serious because they are repetitive. They are neurologically more powerful because they are repetitive. Psalm 119 is the longest chapter in the Bible, and its entire structure is repetitive, meditative recitation of the same theme from 176 different angles. The text is not accidental. The structure is the point. The third is removal of digital stimulation. This is not negotiable. The practice requires the absence of incoming information. No phone, no television. Notifications. The DMN cannot reset when there is a continuous stream of novel stimuli competing for attention. Your grandmother did not have a smartphone. That was not a limitation. It was a structural advantage. You have to create that condition deliberately. The fourth is a gratitude or reflection component, not performance, not recited appreciation, genuine, specific reflection on what is present rather than what is absent. Research on gratitude practice consistently shows reduction in amygdala reactivity, the brain's threat detection center, when people engage in deliberate, specific gratitude rather than anxious future projection. Philippians 4-6 says, "In everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God." With thanksgiving. The thanksgiving is not decorative, it is structural. It is the neurological mechanism that tells your threat system to stand down. The fifth is community or accountability. This is the element most individual wellness programs strip out entirely, and it may be the most important one. Human beings are wired for social connection at a neurochemical level. Genuine relational bonding triggers oxytocin release, and oxytocin is now understood to have direct neuroprotective effects. It reduces inflammatory pathways in the brain, it buffers cortisol, and it appears to support hippocampal health. The Sunday morning gathering, the Wednesday prayer meeting, the women who checked on each other and prayed together, these were not social niceties, they were oxytocin delivery systems. And the generational collapse of communal religious practice has coincided almost precisely with the acceleration of cognitive decline in Western populations. Your grandmother was not just praying, if she was running the world's oldest neuroprotection protocol, and she had no idea. Now I need to say something difficult, and I am going to say it plainly. We dismantled this deliberately, progressively, not through malice, but through the accumulated decisions of a culture that decided efficiency mattered more than ritual, and that science had replaced what tradition provided. The morning routine that protected your grandmother's brain was replaced with a phone alarm, a news feed, and a commute. The communal gathering was replaced with streaming, the repetitive, grounding, cortisol resetting daily practice was replaced with content consumption. Church attendance in the United States has declined by over 20 percentage points in the last 3 decades. That is not just a theological statistic, it is a public health statistic, because what was lost when the communal structure dissolved was not just doctrine, it was the neurological architecture that the structure produced in the people who inhabited it. The fixed time, the repetition, the silence, the community, the accountability, gone. And the dementia rates began climbing with striking correlation. This is not a religious argument. This is a neuroscience argument about what rituals do to brains. The brain does not care whether you are reciting the Lord's Prayer or a gratitude list. It responds to the structure, it responds to the consistency, it responds to the stillness. What your grandmother's faith gave her was an automatic, lifelong delivery system for every single component of what the brain requires to stay healthy. And the tragedy is that we called it old-fashioned and walked away from it. Ecclesiastes 1-9 says, "What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun." The preacher wrote that 3,000 years ago. The neuroscientists are writing it again today, with different equipment but the same conclusion. So what do you do with this? Because I am not going to hand you a problem and leave you standing in it. Here is how you begin. Even if you have not prayed in 40 years, even if the morning routine you have right now is chaos, even if your relationship with the church is complicated, or your relationship with organized religion is something you are not ready to unpack, you do not need to have that resolve to begin. Start with 10 minutes. 10 minutes, same time every morning, no phone present. That is the irreducible minimum. One focus object. If you are a person of faith, use scripture. Use the words you were taught as a child and may have set aside. If you are starting from a different place, use a gratitude list. Write down 3 specific things, not general things, specific ones. The conversation you had with your daughter yesterday, the way the light came through the window this morning, the fact that your body got you out of bed, specific, named, real. By days 4 through 7, add a spoken or written reflection. Say something out loud, write something down. The vocalization activates different neural pathways than silent thought. Your grandmother sang, she spoke the words of the Psalms out loud. There was a reason for that, and it was not merely devotional. By the second week, find one person to practice with or to report to, a spouse, a friend, a sibling. Tell them what you are doing. Ask them to ask you how it is going. That accountability creates the social bonding element that the research identifies as a separate and independent neuroprotective variable. You need it. This is not optional self-improvement advice. This is what the data says the brain requires. Consistency beats intensity. Every time. Your grandmother did not have an elaborate practice. She was not meditating for 90 minutes with a specialized methodology. She sat in a chair. She was quiet. She spoke to God. She did it every day for 60 years. That is the entire protocol: fixed time, repetition, stillness, reflection, community, done daily. James 1:25 says, "But the one who looks into the perfect law of liberty and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets but a doer who acts, that person will be blessed in what he does." The text places the blessing not on the knowledge, not on the hearing, on the doing, the daily doing, the perseverance. Now let me bring this home. My grandmother sat in the same chair every morning, same time, same prayers, same cup of tea going cold on the table beside her because she was not paying attention to the tea. She was somewhere else entirely. I used to walk through that room as a child and think it looked like nothing. An old woman, quiet, eyes closed or moving slowly across a page, nothing happening. I was wrong about almost everything. What was happening in that chair was a decades-long practice of neurological protection that no pharmaceutical company has yet been able to replicate in a pill. What was happening was cortisol suppression, default mode network quieting, hippocampal preservation, and social bonding across a lifetime. What was happening was that a woman who had survived grief and hardship and decades of difficulty was refusing every single morning to let her brain be consumed by the chronic stress that kills so many minds before the body gives out. Her doctor called it luck. Of science calls it neuroplasticity. And I call it watching the wisest woman I ever knew sit in the same chair at the same time every single morning. And now, finally, understanding why. The habit she kept was not a relic of a less enlightened time. It was a technology, ancient, tested, refined across generations of people who knew, somehow, that the morning belonged to something other than the noise. Scripture established the pattern. Science is confirming what was always there. The question now is not whether the research is real. The question is what you are going to do with it, because the chair is still available. The morning is still capable of the same protection your grandmother built, if you are willing to build it. If someone in your life came to mind during this teaching, a grandmother, a parent, an elder whose mind stayed sharp in a way that always seemed like grace, share this with them or share it for them. It may be the word that changes how someone in your circle starts tomorrow morning. Walk wisely,